Hello and welcome to the Storm of Scripture. I'm Jeff Johnson. Today we'll be looking at the second trumpet in Revelation chapter 8. Each of these trumpets are judgments on the spheres of creation. The first was a judgment on earth, and the second trumpet we'll look at in detail today is a judgment on the sea. We're going to talk about what that great burning mountain might be that is thrown from heaven into the sea. We'll talk about the consequences of the sea turning to blood, killing animals, and destroying ships, including an investigation into what John might mean when he qualifies the creatures of the sea that die to those who have life, an unusual qualification for the statement. And we'll talk about the ships, which are the only items of human manufacture to be affected by any of these first four trumpets. Thank you for joining me today as we examine the treasures in Revelation chapter 8, verses 8 and 9. In our walk through Revelation, we have come to the trumpet of chapters 8 and 9. Last week we started with the first trumpet. And as last week, I wanted to kind of set the conclusion or what I think is going on with at least these first four trumpets. The trumpets of chapter 9, which are trumpets 5 and 6, are quite different than the first four, which is kind of a pattern with John and the vision, because the first four seals of the scroll were quite different from the last three. But 1, 2, 3, and 4 have their own kind of cohesion. They're all very similar, and that follows through with the trumpets as well. But I wanted to kind of give that overview of what the trumpets mean. All of them, possibly, definitely the first four. That there are supernatural forces guiding natural phenomena that result in God's justice on the wicked. These four trumpets, the first four, are representative of the four spheres or realms of creation. We looked last week at the first one, which corresponds to the earth. The judgment was poured out on the earth. But there are three other realms of creation. The sea, which was the salt water of the earth. The rivers, which are the fresh water and the source of life, unlike the sea, where salt water is not a source of life. You can drink salt water and not be refreshed. You can easily die at sea because it was such a treacherous place to be. So the sea was always a symbol of chaos and of the threat of death. The rivers, though, were life-giving and a source of thriving. And then there was the divine realm of the heavens. Now, we distinguish between the atmosphere and the outer space, but that was not so in the ancient world. Everything that was in the sky was the realm of God's power only and divine influence only. The sun, the moon, the stars, and they often even thought of the sun, the moon, and the stars as being a kind of embodiment of divine beings. The heavenly host was used interchangeably for the starry sky and the angelic beings that God had created. The heavenly hosts were kind of equated, and that factors into some of what we see happening with the four trumpets. Now we're going to move to the second trumpet here, Revelation 8, verses 8 and 9. The second angel blew the trumpet, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea. And a third of the sea became blood, and a third of the creatures in the sea, the ones which had life, died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. Clearly, we have moved from the earth to the sea. This is a judgment from the waters of the Mediterranean Sea, I believe, because we're talking about Rome. The thread I'm following through here is that this is judgment, partial judgment upon a corrupt and persecuting human empire. and that this middle section of the trumpets is about judgment on empire in history, on human government in history. I believe the second vision of John starts in chapter 4 and goes all the way through chapter 11. I think that chapters 10 and 11 are a hinge point, a point where the second vision starts to anticipate the third, and that there is a definite pivot in those chapters. So when we get to chapters 10 and 11, we'll talk about that. Certainly through chapters 9, we see a judgment on human history, within human history, on particular governments. And the reason I say that is partly due to this constant mention of a third of whatever is going on. It is a third of the sea that becomes blood, a third of the creatures that die, a third of the ships. Not all of them. That kind of universal wrath and judgment is not poured out until the last section of the book. Here it is partial, and I believe focused on a particular persecuting government, in this case, Rome. It is not like God hasn't poured out his judgment on previous corrupt governments, such as Egypt, such as Babylon. These earlier governments that have oppressed God's people have had similar judgments poured out on them. The plagues of Egypt before the Exodus, for example, or judgment on Babylon for its destruction of Jerusalem. God has poured his judgment out on historic governments that have oppressed his people, and I believe this section of Revelation is a promise to those Christians who are being oppressed by Rome that God is going to pour out his judgment on Rome as well for its actions. But this is not about particular events as much as it is about God's power to execute judgment in every sphere of creation, against the earth and here against the sea. Now, what is executing this judgment is described as a great mountain burning with fire that was thrown into the sea. What does this describe? We've discussed the destruction that was caused by Vesuvius, which blasted part of it into the sea. The descriptions of the explosion of Vesuvius by those few survivors who actually witnessed it was like a mountain blowing up into the sea because of the way of the explosion happened. I think a meteorite is also a very interesting hypothesis, that if we're looking for a natural phenomena guided by supernatural power, a meteorite striking the Mediterranean Sea would fit this description quite well. This phrase, though, a great mountain burning with fire, curiously enough, is actually found in the book of Enoch. Now, I have referenced Enoch at various times. I don't think the book of Enoch was inspired scripture, but it was certainly a well-known bit of literature in the first century, and most Jews ascribed to the idea of how heaven and earth are related to each other. Even if it's not scripture, it was a common understanding of what heaven is like and how things work. And there was an interesting similar description in 1 Enoch chapter 21, verses 1 through 3. In case you're not familiar with the overall story, Enoch is the Enoch from in Genesis who walked with God and then was not, and because God took him, that Enoch. Enoch is taken into heaven. Then he, at one point in the book of Enoch, he's given a tour of heaven, taken and shown different places. And on this tour, we've come to this point in 1 Enoch 21, 1 through 3. Then I visited an unprepared place. There I beheld an awesome work. I saw neither heaven above, nor did I behold the established earth, but an unprepared and fearful place. And there I beheld 7 of the stars of heaven bound and thrown into it like great mountains burning with fire. Now when he uses the word unprepared, I believe we might use the word like uncreated or disordered, chaotic. This is a place that has not been shaped by God's power as the earth has been in Genesis chapter 1. This is a place that has not been made good by God's organization and creation. And so it is this unprepared place. Unlike, he says, I did not behold the established earth. The established word would be something that God has created, shaped, and filled with his life-giving power. But this is not like that. And he sees 7 stars of heaven thrown in as great mountains burning with fire. From the wider context of Enoch, it's clear that these stars of heaven are angelic beings. And since they're being bound and thrown into this unprepared place, uncreated, chaotic place, we can believe that they are rebellious angels. They have turned against God and are rebelling against him. And that's clear from the context of Enoch. That is what is happening, is that these rebellious angels are being bound and thrown into this place. But they, the angels themselves, appear like giant mountains burning with fire. So I think there is a strong suggestion based on this connection and parallel that is an angel being tossed into the Mediterranean Sea, as I envisioned it, or into the sea, burning, fiery, and being thrown down into the sea. This does not negate the possibility of a meteorite. They equated the stars with angelic beings, and they would have equated meteorites with falling stars, falling angelic beings to the earth. So they may have seen this and read this and imagined a celestial being being cast into the sea, creating destruction. A third of the sea becomes blood, a third of the creatures in the sea die, and a third of the ships are destroyed. So it has these 3 effects. I really got curious about this qualification on which creatures in the sea. I pick up on minutia sometimes, and I am very grateful that this class has walked with me through these sometimes rabbit trails. You may not find them as interesting as but I'm just curious about these things. Why qualify it? What does John mean when he says the ones who had life? Well, he actually didn't use the word that means alive versus dead. He used the word here, suke, the ones which had a suke. Suke is most often translated as soul in the New Testament. And it comes into our English long time later as psyche and psychology and so on. But suke, it does mean life. Like a person's suke, if you lose your suke, you are dead. That is true. Your suke is what makes you a living being. But it's translated as soul most of the places. And it is connected in the Greek Old Testament with the word nephesh, because in the Greek Old Testament, almost every place where in Hebrew it says nephesh, you hit suke in the translation. So, and the nephesh was connected with breathing and being a living, breathing creature. In fact, when God creates man, he breathes into him and makes him a living nephesh. It's that process that makes him a nephesh, a living creature. And the animals that are like the beasts of the field are also said to be living nephesh, living beings of the same kind. In some translations, I've seen even the word nephesh be described as soul-ish, like you have a soul. And I think if you've been around creatures like horses, or even our pets like dogs and cats, they feel like they have a soul. They have a brain, they think, they respond, and sometimes even emotional ways. They show fear, they show excitement, they show interest. We connect to them. And I think that partly, maybe this idea of the ones which had life would refer to those creatures that we can perceive, sea life that actually seems to be breathing and living. Well, sea mammals, whales, dolphins, things like that. Maybe even fish, not like crustaceans, but I'm thinking about actual fish. They appear to breathe. I mean, they're not really breathing air. That's actually something we only know because of science, and science that was not available in the ancient world. So again, on this rabbit trail, I decided I would try to figure out, what does John mean by the ones which had life/breathing? Could there be some context to it? Well, turns out that in the 1st century, about the same time of John, contemporary with John, is a man named Pliny the Elder. Pliny the Elder, like so many of these ancient philosophers and thinkers, thought about everything. I mean, when you don't have the internet and television to distract you, you can spend a lot of time just thinking about things and observing them and writing it down. And Pliny the Elder is one of these. He has a book called The Natural History, which covers just scads of topics. But one of them is sea life and what it means to be a breathing creature of the water. I picked out a couple of paragraphs which I found fascinating and which therefore I am sharing with you. In his Natural History, Book 9, Chapter 6, and he's talking about a kind of whale called a baleine. I think we have a baleen whale. I'm not sure if it's the same thing exactly, but the terminology was kind of picked up from this name, this Greek name. He says, this baleine have a mouth in the forehead, and hence it is that as they swim on the surface of the water, they discharge vast showers of water in the air. It is universally agreed, however, that they respire. In other words, they breathe. As do a very few other animals in the sea, which have lungs among their internal viscera. For without lungs, it is generally supposed that no animal can breathe. Those, too, who are of this opinion are of opinion also that no fishes that have gills or are so constituted as to inhale and exhale alternately, nor, in fact, many other kinds of animals even, which are entirely destitute of gills. This, I find, was the opinion of Aristotle, who, by his learned researches on the subject, has induced many others to be of the same way of thinking. So here Pliny the Elder kind of confirms that they thought of these living creatures, these breathing creatures, nephesh type, as whales, dolphins, and mammals of the sea. It's not quite as airtight as that, because you kind of may pick up on the fact that Pliny the Elder is saying it is supposed that no animal can breathe if he doesn't have lungs. You know, they did have some rudimentary autopsy ability to examine the innards of these creatures, so they knew that they had lungs. The whales and other creatures like that had lungs. So they got that far along. Unfortunately, it wasn't a universal opinion at the time. Here's Pliny. He's going to give his opinion in the next paragraph. I shall not, however, conceal the fact that I, for one, do not by any means at once describe to this opinion. For it is very possible, if such be the will of nature, that there may be other organs fitted for the purposes of respiration and acting in the place of lungs, just as in many animals a different liquid altogether takes the place of blood. And who, in fact, can find any ground for surprise that the breath of life can penetrate the waters of the deep when he sees that it is even exhaled from them? I think he means the fact that fish create bubbles. Now, they're extracting O2 from the water. That's another scientific process that he doesn't understand, but it looks like they're breathing out air because they create bubbles. He says, and we find, too, that it can even enter the very depths of the earth, an element of so much greater density, a thing that is proved by the case of animals which always live underground. The mole, for instance. If a mole, which is clearly a mammal and needs to breathe, can breathe underground, then why couldn't a fish breathe in the water? He doesn't quite understand that the density thing is not quite as he is imagining it, but he's doing his best for a first century observer. There are other weighty reasons as well which induce me to be of the opinion that all aquatic animals respire conformably to their natural organization. Pliny thinks they all breathe. They just breathe differently somehow than the ones with lungs. But I still think that maybe this qualification of the ones which had life are kind of pointing to those mammalian sea animals. Whether that's important or not, I don't know, but it does seem to be interesting that John feels it needs that clarification. Yeah. Of course, this doesn't explain everything, even a meteorite. What about the sea becoming blood? Oh, there is a possible naturalistic explanation. Now, I am not saying that this isn't supernatural, but I am saying that if this is meant to be a picture of what might happen in Rome, and if it ever did happen, even near what was described, then there would be some naturalistic explanation. Because if these things were played out, they were played out in the realm of nature. And there is a naturalistic explanation for a sea becoming blood. It's called a red tide. And it actually could follow a meteorite explanation because it stirs up so much stuff in the bottom, the algae in the bottom of the sea. And that's what creates the red tide. I won't read this whole explanation, but you can look it up online. I found this on encyclopedia.com. But basically, any time that there's a bloom of algae, and if the algae have a certain toxic element in them, which several do, it could create a reddish color to the water and be toxic to animals that swim through it because they eat it and it's toxic to them. That is possible explanation of the water turning red, if we need a naturalistic explanation for it. And then, of course, the third of the ships are destroyed. Now, this we would ascribe to the impact of the great mountain, the burning mountain as it hits, or to the tidal waves or tsunami that might follow such a strike. So it is destructive. What I want to pick up on and explore here is the fact that the ships are really the only human construction that's destroyed in any of the first four trumpets. Why would ships be so important as to mention as part of this justice or judgment carried out on the sea? Every area that's being affected by the trumpets is going to adversely affect human life. And when it comes to the sea, the shipping and trading on the sea was really as lifeblood for Rome. Rome produced very little of its own consumable products. Almost everything that people lived on in Rome came from somewhere else. They were very much a mercantile society and had very few natural resources of their own. They imported almost everything. We see this emphasis on shipping even later in the book of Revelation, in that last section in chapter 18. In a section that really surprises me, in chapter 18, verses 17, the last part through 19, I just want to read it to point out this emphasis on shipping. Every shipmaster and every seafarer and sailors and all those who labor on the sea stood far off and began to cry out when they saw the smoke of her burning, that's the burning of Babylon, saying, "Who is like the great city?" And they threw dust on their heads and were crying out, weeping and mourning, saying, "Woe, woe, the great city, in which all those who had ships on the sea became rich from her prosperity, because in 1 hour she has been laid waste." We will get to the destruction of Babylon in more detail when we get to chapter 18, but the emphasis here is on these sailors and ships. They have a speaking role in Revelation 18 describing the fall of the empire. Why would shipping be so important? Well, it was a very important lifeblood. It was essential for Rome to maintain their lifestyle with such a large city in a place with few natural resources. But it was also the lifeblood of the sailors and the people who ran the ships, because they depended on that commerce to make their money and for their own living. So the destruction of the ships at sea by this second trumpet judgment is a significant blow to the empire. Thanks again for joining me in the study of Scripture. The Revelation can be a controversial book to study, so if you'd like to comment on my understanding of this passage or express your own interpretation, please comment here in YouTube under the video, or come over to the Storm of Scripture discussion group on Facebook to have an even more detailed discussion. I look forward to our next opportunity to study the Scriptures together as we examine the treasures in the biblical text.